right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. Today we have a very special privilege of having with us as a guest Ralph Ellis, and he is the author of what I think 10 books, isn't it, Ralph?
Yeah, I think we just crept over 10 now. I think I'm on 11. Not quite sure,
Okay.
but sufficient.
Awesome. Yeah. And your books are like about sort of, what would you say, alternate history of?
Alternate theology. So it's theology, historical theology, written from an agnostic atheist background. So I'm not religious. All I'm doing is looking at the history because I was concerned that nobody can find the real history within the biblical story.
Right, and it is such an important story in terms of the effect that it has had and continues to have on the global population today. So whether you believe any of it or not, it certainly is an important thing.
Yes, indeed. I mean, if you're going to believe it, you might as well believe in the truth of it rather than the fairy stories, as I like to say.
Right. So that's the thing is I mean, from my own studies, I've found that it's there's maybe one way to say it would be that there's a lot of layers, and of course different perspectives. There's the fact that history is always told by the winners, and there's also a lot of politics. And I mean, really, is religion? One could make the argument that religion is nothing but politics. There's a lot of motivations and hidden agendas and not so hidden agendas, and a lot of stuff to dig through with thousands of years of misinformation, disinformation, as well as some actual information as well. Okay, so yeah. So your latest book is focusing on?
Well, that latest one is a bit of an oddity. So the latest one is just a question and answer session. So it's all the questions and answers that I put out on my Facebook site, which is Facebook ralphellis.144. And I had 5 years of questions and answers, and some of those questions were very good, very, very deep and very probing. So I thought, well, that's it's a valuable resource. So I just gathered them all together, put them into a book, and that's now called Shards of Illumination. And it clarifies a lot of the aspects that maybe I didn't explain, well enough in the first place, because these are fairly complex books. I mean, I like to write for the the casual observer. It's not an academic book. But there are, a good number of references, and everything is taken from original sources. So it could be used as a reference material, but I do write for the common man, as it were, rather than the academic.
Right. So I want to talk about these original sources for a minute, because I think that's really important. There's a lot of people writing sort of speculative topics and really not giving very much in terms of references or background information, and basically just saying like something like, oh, the Sumerians said this. Okay, well, where I want to check that out. I want to know which tablet you're referring to, what line, and all that stuff. So give us a little bit of background on how you approach that and what.
I've never really read many of the other authors. So I've read some of the venerable theologians and historians from the Victorian era, who I appreciate, I like them, but I don't use any of the modern ones. So basically, I've just gone back to the original manuscripts, to the Torah, to the the Tanakh, I suppose, the New Testament, the Talmud, Josephus Flavius, of course, because he's very big in everything to do with biblical history. Roman sources, Syriac sources, which turned out to be very useful in my last couple of books, because they tell the same story as Josephus Flavius, but they tell it from a different perspective. You have to remember that Josephus was writing for the Romans, and so everything he wrote has a Roman bias to it. And you have to allow for that bias in order to understand what he's talking about.
Right.
For those who are not familiar, Josephus Flavius wrote an entire Old Testament, which is like a secular Old Testament. So it's a historical Old Testament. And you can use that in some respects to see what the Old Testament was trying to talk about. Because it's the same story, but without the fairy story, without the fairy dust, as I call it, being placed upon it. And then he writes the sort of an equivalent of the New Testament as well, his Jewish Wars, which again is a secular story, is a historical story, without the fairy dust that's been applied to the gospel story. Okay. So that's quite useful. So you have a lot of different sources, and then there's a whole raft of these what they call apocryphal gospels, which some people dismiss them, but I think they contain a reasonable amount of good information.
Mm-hmm. And do you get into things like Augustine and like those kind of guys, the theologians?
I do sometimes, but again, you've got to be so careful when using them, because you know they're Christian authors and they're writing from a Christian perspective. But the ones that are quite valuable is the Against Heresies. There are two compendiums of Against Heresies where they're mocking other religions to Christianity. And of course, that's useful because it preserves what those religions actually used to do and what they look like. So yes, books like that are useful, yes. Okay.
So, so you brought up Josephus's take on the Old Testament. So how does he deal with this story of the Exodus and the odd apparitions or whatever these experiences were that the Israelites had at Mount Sinai and some of these other types of things? What does he say about that?
Oh, well, he's giving the same story more or less in his Antiquities, he calls it. So he gives the full history of the Jews. But he gives it, as I say, from a secular perspective. So you get a different viewpoint of what's going on. So while the Old Testament will say, Abraham, for instance, was a shepherd who had 300 servants, I think is what it says.
He's had an army of 300 standing army of 300 fighting men.
That's right. So when you read Josephus, it's not servants, it's actually army officers.
Okay.
And that sort of changes the story.
That's literally in Genesis before he goes to rescue Lot.
Yeah, but it's worded in a different fashion. It's worded as being servants, not army officers. So Josephus is making it much more clear that he's talking about an army. Okay. And that changes the story entirely, because what shepherd in charge of a few starving sheep has an army of 30,000 people?
Right.
They don't. I mean, that would just be impossible. So we're not talking about agriculture here. What we're talking about is the Hyksos shepherd kings.
Okay.
So at that era, well, if you're looking at the biblical chronology, a little bit before that era, but I say the biblical chronology should go back by about 300 years. And so in the sort of 1500s BC, 1600s BC, there was a line of shepherd kings. They were known as the shepherd kings, and they were the Hyksos.
And they were in Egypt.
Yeah, they were in northern Egypt. So they controlled northern Egypt. Egypt was divided at the time, and in the south we had a different pharaoh. And these people would indeed have had an army of 30,000 men. And an awful lot of the things about the Hyksos match up with the biblical story. So a lot of the names are similar. I mean, for instance, one of the pharaohs is called Jacob. Pharaoh Jacob or Jacob.
I looked that up. There's actually 3 or 4 pharaohs that were named Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's not made much of in modern history, but of course, we have a direct link there with the biblical story. So instead of talking about agricultural shepherds, perhaps we're talking about shepherd kings. And strangely enough, in his later book, Against Apion, Josephus Flavius says exactly that. He says that the Hyksos were our people, and he directly links the Israelites with the Hyksos shepherd kings.
So is Josephus Jewish?
Oh yes, yeah, he's their greatest historian, and this is
Well,
the
yeah.
strange thing. He is actually saying that the Israelites were Egyptians. Well, I
Right.
say Egyptians. The Hyksos were supposed to be invaders who came in from Mesopotamia. So there were Semites that came down into Egypt and took over the north of Egypt, Lower Egypt.
So it's basically
and
kind of like
formed
saying
this.
it's sort of like saying that Americans are British.
Yes, sort
I
of.
mean, we are all
they
something, right?
they were fully Egyptianized. You know, you can't really tell much difference after the 200-300 years that they were in Egypt. You can't tell much difference between the Hyksos and the southern Egyptians down in Thebes. They had slightly different emphasis. They tended to like Seth as their god rather than Atum or something like that. So they had some slight differences, but they spoke Egyptian, they wrote Egyptian, their iconography was all Egyptian, so you can't really tell them much apart. But
Right.
there was this civil war between the two.
Isn't Seth one of the sons of Noah?
No, well, sorry, yes, he is.
Adam.
Yeah, well, yes, he is. But in this regard, Seth is the brother of Osiris, so he's the standard
they're
Egyptian
reusing
god.
the name, but you got to wonder what else they're reusing. Like that has to be on purpose.
Yeah, a lot of this story comes out of Egypt. So there are numerous texts which have been incorporated within the Old Testament story. The famous one is Psalm 104, which is based on the hymn to the Arton. But even things like the Lord's Prayer and the Sermon on the Mount and so on, it all comes out of Egyptian literature. So there are strong connections there.
Okay, so if Jacob, so in the Bible we read that that it was Joseph that went to Egypt, and he was sold out by his brothers, goes to Egypt and ends up basically becoming the Pharaoh. It's pretty much like number 2 man, right? So yeah, as good as. So it's not much of a stretch between what's literally taught in Sunday school and what you're saying, or I guess what we can see in the historic records, such as they are. So would you say that there was just like some modifications on the actual history, and if so, why?
It's not so much modifications to the history. As far as I can see, the history is almost 90% correct. The problem is the interpretation we've put upon that history. And it's been interpreted by the establishment, by the Jewish establishment and the Christian establishment, and now indeed by the historical establishment as being something quite different to what it was. So you're just talking about Joseph there, the guy with a coat of many colors who came back down into Egypt. That's probably a true story. And we have this story of Joseph talking to Pharaoh, because Joseph became the prime minister, as it were, of Egypt. He was the number 2, as you say. Well, firstly, he obviously spoke Egyptian. He was fully Egyptianized. He would have known all of the Egyptian religion. Otherwise, he could not have reached that position of prime minister of Egypt. So that shows you how integrated the Israelites were into Egyptian history, into Egyptian culture. But he has this conversation with his brothers, and he says to his brothers, look, you've come down into Egypt, but don't tell Pharaoh that you are don't tell Pharaoh that you are shepherds. Tell him that you've been bull breeders for all your life, because shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, which makes no sense whatsoever, because in agricultural terms, of course, the Egyptians had no program against sheep and shepherds, of course. So
They
it
even had
makes no
sheep
sense.
gods.
Yes, sort of. Sheep as in shepherd kings.
Okay, but also
You see,
some of the gods are pictured with a ram's
yes.
head.
And the bull, of course, is the Apis bull of Egypt. So yes, they
Right.
were gods. But what he's talking about is the procession of the equinox, because we'll come on to this in a minute. But the central symbolism of the Jewish religion is the Zodiac. Now, you might not know that, but we'll talk about this in a minute. And what they're talking about is the processional Zodiac, because the great month of Taurus changed into the great month of Aries. Bull turned into sheep in 1750 BC, and this was the dispute they were talking about. And also, these people were known as the shepherd kings. They were the Hyksos. And so the dispute they were having was theological, as you're saying, between bulls and sheep, between Taurus and Aries. But it was also political. So what Joseph is saying to his brothers is, don't say to Pharaoh that you are a shepherd king, a Hyksos, because you'll be thrown out of the country, because the shepherd Hyksos are an abomination to the Egyptians, which at that time was perfectly true, because this was after the civil war between the Hyksos and the southern Egyptians, and after the Exodus. So the Joseph character had gone back into Egypt. And of course, he didn't want Pharaoh to know that he was from the line of shepherd kings, because they just had a civil war with them just a few hundred years ago. And well, maybe 100 years ago. And that's what he was talking about when he was talking to Pharaoh. So rather than this being a conversation that makes no sense, we might actually have here a verbatim conversation between the Joseph character and the Pharaoh of Egypt that has lasted for 3,500 years.
Okay.
And yet it's quoted verbatim within the Torah.
Right. Okay, so I got to jump on a point here about the timeline. So, according to the biblical timeline, it goes Abraham, Jacob, Isaac,
Yes.
Jacob, Joseph.
Yes.
Then either we don't know how long, there's debate whether it's 100 years or 400 years, how long they're in Egypt, and then comes along Moses and the Exodus after Joseph. Okay,
Yes.
now you have it,
which is
around.
Correct, but no, it's not flipped around. What they've done is they've conflated two Exoduses. So if you read Manetho, who's the Egyptian historian, chronicler, who chronicles this era, he says there were two Exoduses. So the first Exodus was the Great Hyksos Exodus, and that happened 200-300 years earlier than the biblical story likes to say. So that happened in 1580 BC.
Okay.
So that's about 300 or so years before the traditional date. So they were pushed out on the Hyksos Exodus. They came back into the country with the Joseph type character. And then they were pushed out again in 1320 BC with the Akhenaten Exodus. So there were two Exoduses. One was large, one was small. And what the biblical text has done is they've conflated the two. But if we push the Exodus back to the Hyksos Exodus, then this makes much more sense of the story. So here is the Hyksos Exodus. So these are the events from history, not from the Bible. These are the events from history. So we had a group of shepherds. One of their leaders was called Jacob or Jacob. They had earrings and curly side locks of hair. There was storms and darkness for 3 days. There was an ash fall. If you remember the Moses story where Moses said, God said to Moses, take handfuls of ash from the hearth of a fire and cast it into the sky, and it will become small dust across the land of Egypt. Well, that happened during the Hyksos Exodus. So they had an ash fall, they had a tsunami, the waters parting. They had an exodus. It went from Pi-Ramesses, Avaris, and some 350,000 people were kicked out of the country and went to Jerusalem. Familiar story?
So that was as a result of a political outfalling between two parties, essentially, and the losers got kicked out.
Yes, it was also due to the eruption of Santorini. So Santorini was the biggest eruption in recorded history. It was just north of Crete. There's an island there called Santorini, which blew its top in 1600 BC. And it caused chaos throughout the sort of Eastern Mediterranean. It caused the 3 days of darkness. It caused the hail. It caused the great ash fall. I mean, where did this ash fall come from that the Bible describes? The Moses story about this is a perfect description of the long-range fallout from a volcano. And there is only one volcanic eruption in that region in that sort of time period. And that happened in 1600 BC. And it caused a tsunami, of course. There was a huge eruption just over in Greece. And that would have caused a tsunami. It would have caused the waters parting. So the waters would have receded and gone away long enough for the Egyptian army to walk out across the sand, wondering what on earth was going on, you know, picking up the fish that were just stranded there. Right. And then, of course, you know, the waters come back again, as you know, for a tsunami.
Yeah.
So we have here sort of like 3 or 4, oh, and also a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke, if you remember from the Exodus, which was the volcano. So we have about 5 or 6 black swan events, which a black swan being something that is so peculiar that no one could have predicted it. And so what chronicler would have managed to pick 6 black swan events that are all associated with a volcano? Darkness, ashfall, thunderstorms, pillar of fire, pillar of smoke, a tsunami, all in the same story of the Exodus.
Right.
And yet some chronicler managed to get all of those together quite correctly, which matched the Thera Santorini eruption. And so this just has to be an eyewitness account of the Santorini eruption. And that's interesting because it gives us a direct peg upon which to place this Exodus event, the great one, not the small one, but the great one. Right. And it happened just after Santorini. So it happened in about 1580 BC, which is exactly when we had the Hyksos Exodus. And the Hyksos Exodus also had storms and darkness for 3 days, because we have that on the Tempest stela. It tells the same story, but from an Egyptian perspective instead of the Israelite perspective.
Right.
And so of course, when they were...
How far away would you have had to have been to see that? Like, surely you can't see Crete from Egypt.
No, but any sailors going across the sea would have brought those stories back, that there was a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. And of course, someone used that as what they were, you know, guiding them. Right.
But
because
then again, the actual ash cloud certainly could have covered Egypt.
Oh, yes.
Probably absolutely did. In fact, I think I was reading something about that there's actually an archaeological layer, like geologically speaking, there's a layer of ash that covers all of the entire Mediterranean area.
Yeah, they found the ash layer. And of course, Josephus, when he gives this story, he says that the people of Egypt were inwardly consumed by the thickness of the air. It's a perfect description of, I don't know if you've seen those images of Mount St. Helens when that blew up.
I was quite close to it. I've actually
you'll know all
I
about
touched
it.
some of the ash.
Yeah, so that ash was just everywhere, and you can imagine that description from Josephus is just perfect.
Yeah, and it's very fine. It doesn't settle out. It stays in the air for quite a while, and it's just like almost like clay, almost, but just before it settles.
I see these pictures of the police cars, and they had to put these enormous, great filters on the front of them to stop the engines from seizing up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
so,
quite something. Volcanoes are, and also I just happened upon some pictures of volcanoes earlier this morning, which introduced me to a phenomenon I had never seen before, and that is that during a volcanic eruption, there's often it somemew causes lightning.
Lightning, yes.
Yeah. Which I guess makes sense.
In the same manner as hail does. Hail and thunderstorms will create lightning in exactly the same fashion. But yes, you get a lot of storms and thunder.
Yeah. So that's
what we have then in this story is, rather than being a biblical story about events that nobody knows anything about because they can't be latched on to anything within the historical record, what we have, if you look at it rationally, is a perfect eyewitness account of the eruption of Santorini in 1600 and the political ramifications of that, because it caused a civil war. And I'm sure the civil war was something to do with that, because somebody had to be to blame for that. You know, someone had upset the gods.
Yes, of course.
And therefore, you know, the Southerners said, well, it's because of your God, and the Southerners said to the Northerners, it's your God, etc., vice versa.
Yeah.
And that caused a civil war, and that was what caused the Exodus. And of course, the Exodus, the Hyksos Exodus, went from avarice, and avarice is Pi-Ramesses. It's the same town. It just got a different name in later eras. So it went from the same town. It went to the same town. It went to Jerusalem. And of course, it was the Hyksos who destroyed Jericho. So the major stumbling block that everybody says that, you know, there's no evidence for the Exodus because Jericho was destroyed hundreds of years before the Exodus. So, you know, the Exodus is completely wrong. Well, not if we take it as being the Hyksos Exodus, because it was the Hyksos who destroyed Jericho. And again, that sort of matches with the biblical story.
Okay, so, and Jericho, is there archaeological and dating evidence for the destruction of Jericho?
It's been fairly well. It was documented back in the 1930s, and they did another dig in the 50s and 60s by Kathleen, someone, I've forgotten her name for a minute, and she determined that it was much earlier than the 1200s BC. It had to be the 1500s BC, and it had to be something to do with the Hyksos. So that was fairly well documented many decades ago.
Okay, so
Kathleen
Kenyon, we have
I think it was.
Okay, so so let's say that that makes sense to me, and I think that dating, it seems to be verifiable by both Santorini and Jericho. But then on the other hand, we have this whole Akhenaten factor, and that happened, I believe, about 1350 BC.
1320, something of that nature, yes.
Okay, so nearly 300 years later, or more, well, something around that range. So are you saying then that the Jewish scholars somehow forgot that there were two events, or got them mixed up?
I think they were more embarrassed about it. We've already come across an embarrassment, that they don't want to be associated with Egyptians. So they're desperately trying to say that they're not Hyksos, honest, nothing to do with us. We're not Egyptians, we're monotheists. And so we're nothing to do with the 1600 BC Exodus, and they're already covering that up. And now they have another Exodus, the small Exodus. And we have this from Manetho, as I say. He definitely gives the history of two Exodus periods. One is the Hyksos Exodus, and the other one is the Akhenaten Exodus. Akhenaten being the heretic pharaoh from about 1350 BC, was thrown out in about 1320 BC. And we know that they are linked somehow with the Israelites, because Manetho's story blends this story with the Israelites. He's talking about the same sort of people all the time. And so we get these similarities between the two. I mean, for instance, the God name, the name for the Jewish God is Adon. So the Jewish God has several names. He's called Yahweh, of course. He's called Shaddai, Elohim, and he's called Adon, the Aten, because the God of...
Sorry, can I get a reference on that one?
Yeah, it's in Exodus. It's wherever the English translation says Lord God.
Oh,
you will
Adonai.
find that Lord God is Adonai. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And the god of Akhenaten was called the Aten, or it was called the Adon.
Right.
It has the same name.
Or Ra.
And of course,
but the interesting thing to me is that everybody oversimplifies this thing as Akhenaten is monotheistic and is the first monotheist. But really, if you look at what Akhenaten was into, that's kind of sort of true in terms of comparing with, like, he basically lessened a lot of the influence of many of the other Egyptian gods, but he didn't completely do away with all of them. I mean, I guess
he
pretty
did.
Close. Well,
I don't think any of them lasted. I mean, that was the whole point of the big civil war against Akhenaten at the end of his reign, was because he had gone around Egypt cutting out all of the names of the old gods.
Yeah. And
this was very contentious.
Ra? I agree, but Ra is like the head. Like, it's kind of like between Aten and Ra is kind of similar, in my opinion, to like, say, the Holy Spirit and God the Father, where they're the same, but they're also
possibly. But he never honored Ra. He only honored the Aten. He never actually mentioned Ra. Everybody within Akhenaten, his city, had to change their name to the Aten god, so they weren't allowed to keep the old gods. So Amen disappeared, because his name was Amenhotep, of course, and he had to change that name.
And isn't it weird that Amen has become the salutation at the end of prayers for Christians?
And it was the end of the day. So Amen was the evening god. And so it was the end. It was Artem was the evening god. So Arton was the dawn god. That's why he always faced the dawn. Artem was the evening god, the god of the sunset. And then Amen was the god of the sun as he went through the underworld to come back on the other side. And so, yes, he was the hidden god from the underworld.
Very strange. Very strange.
It's quite appropriate, I think, that the end of a hymn is Amen.
Yeah.
As the sun disappears.
Yeah. I wanted to mention this book. I don't think it's really well known, but it's a really great book, Moses Restored, by Jonathan Perrin. And
I've not read that one.
So he makes and it's thick too. So he makes a very solid, in my opinion, case for linking Akhenaten and Moses. He essentially equates them, which of course he didn't invent that idea. It was Freud. Freud actually wrote a book about it. And
yeah, Freud started it. I don't think he linked them totally. He linked their religions. I don't think he linked the characters. But the first one I know is Ahmed Osman in his, well, the first one I think was Stranger in the Valley of the Kings, which is a very good book. And he links up the Joseph character, him of the coat of many colors, with Yuya. And Yuya was the patriarch of the Amarna dynasty. Right.
And so that's the great grandfather of Akhenaten.
Yeah.
And King Tut.
Or grandfather, yes. I'm not sure if it's great or yeah. But anyway, he is the patriarch of that dynasty. But I do something similar, but I've gone on a slightly different tack. So we have, in the biblical story, we have the two famous brothers. We have Aaron and Moses, the two brothers.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, in Amarna, the two brothers were Akhenaten and Tuthmoses. So the brother of Akhenaten was called Moses. That was his name. So you don't really even have to change the story much. All you have to do is drop off the Tuth. And you've got, and Akhenaten can be read in certain, if you mistranslate the hieroglyphs slightly, can be read as being Aaron instead of Akhenaten.
Yeah, I mean, so you've got all the same letters there.
Yeah, pretty much. I think those were the two brothers. And they formed this monotheism. It was pretty much monotheist, which of course they were not prior to that. The Hyksos were not monotheist.
Okay.
So here what
about Zoroastrianism?
I don't delve much into Zoroastrianism. I do a little bit on Mithras, but not so much on Zoroaster.
I guess my point being that was, I believe that predated and was very strictly monotheistic.
Well, they say that, but I find that a lot of the Persian chronology is exaggerated, hugely so. So, I mean, we have the story of Gilgamesh, which they say, you know, predates everything, you know, it's 5000 BC or whatever, you know. But the Gilgamesh story is the same story we've talked about with the Joseph character of Taurus turning into Aries within the processional zodiac. So the great month of Taurus became the great month of Aries in 1750 BC. And if you read the Gilgamesh with his bow and his axe, and he's attacking the bull of heaven to kill the bull of heaven. But he can't get to the bull of heaven until he kills the 6 splendors of the Humbaba. Well, this is astrological again, or astronomical, if you want to put it that way, because on the back of Taurus, we have the Pleiades, which is the 6 or well, it used to be called the 7 sisters, but it's now the 6 sisters. That is the Humbaba. So, and Gilgamesh is Orion. It's a perfect description of Orion completely, attacking Taurus, who's right next door to Orion, and even in the sky, it looks like Orion is attacking Taurus. Right. In order to end the great month of Taurus and bring on the great month of Aries. So this is a story of the cosmos. But the thing about this is, if that is true, then we can date this perfectly. It's 1750 BC. Right. Nothing to do with the 3000 or 4000 BC that they keep claiming for the Epic of Gilgamesh.
That also, though, implies very strongly that the creators of these stories or whatever they're trying to do, the writers were aware of very complex and long-term astronomical alignments and positioning and basically physics and math and computational stuff that we have only been able to really reproduce, I would say, in the last 70 years. Computationally, we had no way of calculating that.
Yes, but they did, because if you observe the stars, you can see they're moving. I mean, within precession, the stars will move 1 degree in 72 years. So, okay, it's within a person's lifetime. He can see that the star has moved with precession. But we know that they were tracking this because we have the Joseph story that we've just talked about, bulls and sheep, Taurus and Aries. But they carried on this tradition into the New Testament. So, you know, Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men. And of course, the great month of Aries ended in AD 10 and became the great month of Pisces, lambs to fish. It's the same story. It's the same zodiac that they were following, the processional zodiac. And people won't believe that the primary symbol of Judaism was the zodiac. But if you go around the archaeology of Judea and Jordan, they've already discovered 8 synagogues with a zodiac on the floor. And a big one, you know, 4 or 5 meters across, big mosaic. And the best one, anyone can, in fact, I've got an image here, actually. I don't know if I can share this. Dare I try to?
You know what, just send it. I'll put it up afterwards. Just
okay.
Send me the link. Picture.
I'll do that. But over on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, there is the great zodiac of Hamat Tavera. And that's in a synagogue, of course, an ancient synagogue, but not a traditional Jewish one. This is a Nazarene synagogue, and it was owned by Jesus. That was the guy who owned it. Now, I say this was the biblical Jesus. Other people would disagree, of course, and they'll say, oh, no, it's just a similar name. No, I think this was the biblical Jesus, because the biblical Jesus was a Nazarene.
So and it's a guy named zodiac. Yeshua would have been.
Yeah, but I don't think his name was Yeshua.
Okay.
His name was Esus. In my historical record. It's a Persian name. It's not a Judaic name. Okay. And it's a perfect Greco-Egyptian zodiac. And with all the same symbols that you're familiar with. And it's a processional zodiac, because the head of Helios, and that's an incongruous thing for a second, the central character, the sun character, is Helios, the Greek sun god. I mean, this is totally heretical for a Jewish, but it is Jewish, because we know it's in a synagogue, and B, the panel above it has the Temple of Solomon, it has the Ark of the Covenant, it has the shofar, it has all of the accoutrements of Judaism sitting above this zodiac. So we know it's a Jewish zodiac. And
so this could be a way of encrypting, if you will, not terribly cryptically, but basically building in ancient knowledge, like almost like a hermetical tradition or whatever. Because I mean, I think that there's a lot of bad things you could say about them, but on the other hand, there does seem to be a concern for this important knowledge, and whether that knowledge may be misguided or not, but there is this concern that we have to pass along this ancient knowledge, and whether that is, in terms of salvation or in terms of other possibly like more Gnostic ideas or whatever. So that could be an element of that.
Oh, we know they did, because this zodiac was passed on to the Knights Templar much later on, and it became the Arthurian Round Table. So Arthurian legend, which I've got a whole book on, the historical Arthurian legend, which is very different to any other history about King Arthur. But according to the manuscripts, they actually copied this. So the first round table was the Last Supper table of Jesus. So you have Jesus and the 12 disciples. The second was the round table of Joseph of Arimathea, which was again a round table with 12 disciple knights. And the third round table was the round table of King Arthur. So the King Arthur and his 12 disciple knights around the round table. That table was based on the Last Supper table. But the Last Supper table was based upon the Zodiac. So all of these round tables are not tables as such, they are zodiacs. And each of the knights would have a constellation that represented them. And the king character, the Jesus character or the Arthur character, sat in the center of the table. So not around the outside, there was a hole in the center of the table. And the king would sit in the center because he was Helios. He was the sun god, he was the sun.
Right.
And
so when we look at the word table, though, it's interesting because it does have this other meaning. Anybody who's ever used a spreadsheet or a database
yes.
thinks of a table in a completely different way. And that is truly what the Zodiac is that it is a table of information. And it's round.
It is, yeah. But originally that table would have been the mosaic on the floor, because in the East you didn't use tables. You used to sit on the floor. And so I've no doubt that each, disciple would have their cushion, and they would bring their cushion and sit around this zodiac, and they would eat at the table, while imbibing as well the procession of the equinox and the story of the solar system and the cosmos and everything else that this represented. Right. So it was instructional as well as being social, as well as being, a dining table, as it were. And it was from that dining table that the Arthurian table was derived. Right. And we have a good idea this was true because down the road on the Sea of Galilee, again, just down the road at Bet Shean, which is a Jewish Roman site, they have a later table, mosaic, which is in a Christian monastery. So this is a Christianized zodiac. And instead of the constellations being depicted, they have 12 men around the outside, each being depicted by a month. But of course, a month is a zodiac constellation. They turn with each other in the skies above at the same rate.
Right.
And in the center, the two characters in the center are a man and a woman identified with the sun and the moon. Now, who is the man and the woman surrounded by 12 men in this sort of era? It's obviously, it's an image of Jesus and Mary Magdalene surrounded by the 12 disciples, but they've turned it into a zodiac calendar. And again, this is a huge thing. It's like 6 meters across or more. It's an enormous, great zodiac. So the zodiac was the primary symbol of Nazarene Judaism and early Christianity in this region. And that's why I think that all of this imagery and this knowledge came out of Egypt, because this is where these people came from. Mm-hmm. Jesus went to Egypt for his education.
Yeah. And Moses was an Egyptian magician, but Daniel was a Babylonian magician. And this zodiacal theme pops up in Egypt as well as Sumer and Babylon and all of this stuff. My personal take on it is that it is a calendar. It is a timekeeping device. Of course, it is used for that, but that's not the primary purpose of the zodiac because it's actually a geographic or a more a cosmological map, I suppose you would say. It's about directions and places, and then you can use that for timekeeping as well. But that's that's kind of what I'm looking at in some of the writing I'm doing. as of late.
It could be, but certainly the monarchs used it as a chronometer so that they could keep track of
Yeah, absolutely.
who was in which month. So you have people like, Alexander the Great and Ptolemy the Third all wearing the horns of a ram in their hair because they were born under the great month of Aries, and so they have the horns of a ram.
Okay.
So
but that's not because they were born. It's not because they were born in March or whatever, but it's because the era that they are in, the entire era, is the era of Aries.
Absolutely. And
which is
after,
interesting.
within Arthurian legend, we have the whole line of Fisher Kings. Why do we have Fisher Kings? Because that was the great month of Pisces.
Right. So, but I guess to me, I'm just really not sure what that means. Okay, like let's say that well, I mean, really, this is sort of the equivalent of the, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Okay,
yes,
but
that's next.
So what? I mean, like, what does it mean? Well, there's going to be a shift in attitude, all this stuff. Well, okay, yeah, I mean, sure, maybe, but you can't say that for the last 2,000 years during this age of the fish was any different than the age of the ram or the age of the bull before that. It's the same. People are always doing the same stuff. We have, I don't know, I'm not a historian, so maybe you could speak to this. Is there really a shift in attitude and human activity every 2,000 years?
No, I think what they were doing is more in line with your investigations. I don't like to get esoteric too much, but obviously your viewers probably are on the esoteric side, so I don't mind doing so. What they were doing is counting off the millennia from the last visitation to the next visitation. So we're talking about ancient aliens here, and the way you can track the next visitation is via the precession of the equinox. It gives you a perfect calendar to know exactly when they will arrive next. So that's what they were doing.
So that's if we're assuming that we're only going to be getting maybe there's a portal that opens or something like that, and it has to do with being aligned with the galactic core or something. I
would imagine travel is just bloody difficult, and so you can't come very often, and so you have to set a time in the future. And of course, we've got a precessional clock, which is a 26,000 year clock, and so you can give a precise time. You can say end of Pisces or whatever it is, whatever date you want to give. End of Pisces. We'll see you again. And see you, chaps. Off you go. Have a good time now. We'll see you in 12,000 years' time.
Well, if it is the end of Pisces, then I guess we'll find out soon enough.
Yeah. Although I date end of Pisces to about 2,300, because it's quite a long, it's a wide constellation. So it depends where you draw the line between Pisces and Aquarius.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's it for this session. We're going to break the session into two or three parts because it was a long one. So look for the part 2 and possibly part 3 in the list below. Thanks for watching. And here's the info about Ralph's books. You're going to want to check those out at edfubooks.com. And we will be back with more Ralph Ellis.
Please visit our sponsor, neandertees.com, fashion for the discriminating Neanderthal.